Hello! It's Bectober and time to start filling this watercolour sketchbook. I'm going to focus on 4 sets of Daniel Smith Triads, Stormbreaker, Architectural, Evening Glow and Desert Horizons. There's heaps to paint, so let's get into it! Now, I released a video last month swatching all 8 of the Triad sets. Today I'm going to focus on the themes page, but we also have this lot of seasons. I figured it's far too much to do in one video, so I'm just going to focus on these 4. And then we'll go on to a second video with the seasons. I decided to do Bectober after I'd swatched those in that other book, otherwise I could have just done them in here to begin with. But no matter, I've already ruled out another page and I'm going to do another swatch of these colours today. Just so that we can remember all of them, and then I'll go into all of the paintings. This also gives me a chance to fix a mistake I made last month. I accidentally bought the gouache version of the lavender and not the watercolour, so that may have affected the swatch a little bit. Here's the tube I bought, which blatantly says gouache on there, and I did not see that until someone pointed it out in the video. Thank you for that. And here is the watercolour tube. To be fair, they do look pretty similar, and the displays were next to each other as well, so I shall call that an honest mistake. I have actually filled a new pan with the watercolour, and I'll get the other pan with the gouache because now it's dry, it's most obviously gouache. You can see how it's cracked, and it's also very matte. When I put it next to the watercolour, you'll be able to see quite a difference between watercolour and gouache there. Ah well, the colour at least is the same, so I don't think it's going to create that much of a difference in the swatching. It's just that the gouache will be more opaque. That cost me more money than anticipated, so we'll scooch those gouaches out of the way and focus on the watercolour. Now I'm just going to drip some water on each of the pans just to make sure they're all properly activated. And now for a quick little swatching session, just to remind ourselves of all of the colours. In this first Stormbreaker triad, we have Bloodstone Genuine, Iridescent Electric Blue, and Prussian Blue. My first impressions were I really loved the colours in this set. I think it's absolutely beautiful. Plus we have some iridescence in here, so it's going to be interesting to paint with. Next is Architectural with Buff Titanium, Lavender Watercolour, and Sepia. I thought this was quite an intriguing trio of colours, and I was thinking it would probably look quite good for buildings, but could I make actual paintings with such a limited colour palette? And fortunately the watercolour looks pretty much the same as the gouache when I did my mixes. Next is Evening Glow with a very bright new gamboge, a manganese blue hue, and shadow violet, not blue, which I just noticed at this point, so I found some correction tape and made sure I wrote violet instead. Here we go with that one. It's an interesting palette. I wasn't sure how this was going to go for Evening Glow. I wasn't fully convinced by this trio of colours, so today I'm going to paint with them and find out if I like it or not. I do love the colours individually though. They are really beautiful, especially New Gamboge. Last is Desert Horizons with Amazonite Genuine, Monte Amiata Natural Sienna, and Burnt Sienna Light. This was another one which I was thinking may not be too applicable for Australian colours, just because they're not quite right, and we'll find out later how I go with that because I did pick some Australian pictures. So here they all are once they're dry. I haven't worried about pigment numbers or anything today. Watch the other video if you want to see all of that. I just want to focus on the paintings, but I also just wanted to remind myself what the colours are like before I got into it. I wanted to fill a page spread for each lot of colours, so I'm basically going to do 8 pages today. It's a lot of work and I was a bit nervous that I wasn't going to be able to do it, but spoiler, I did. Anyway, here's the lavender gouache compared with the lavender watercolour. Same colour, but the lavender watercolour is more transparent and granulating than the gouache, it seems. It'll be the binder, otherwise the colour palette looks the same. Oh my gosh, I'm so scared about Evening Glow. That yellow and blue are just going to mix into green. It's probably not the best look for a sky. I was just wondering how I was going to do this. And then Desert Horizons, I had a bit too much water, I think, on the Burnt Sienna Light, and I've got a few dried air bubbles there. Anyway, it's time to stop procrastinating and do some painting. Ah, look at those blank pages. I was just going, what on earth am I going to paint? But first up is Stormbreaker. Now, I did a lot of preparation before filming this because I knew it was going to take ages, and I started off with a thin black pen, but I went to a fatter one because it was taking too long to write the letters in. I used a stencil for all of my lettering today. I wanted to stay on theme, so I went through and found reference images for all of the pictures that I'm doing today. Actually, Stormbreaker, I had to find ones that weren't in my own collection because I really didn't have anything stormy, and I'm just swatching out the three colours again as a reminder to myself as well. Bloodstone, Iridescent Electric Blue, and Prussian Blue. And the first one I'm doing something pretty basic, a whole bunch of storm clouds. I found a reference image online. I started off with the Prussian Blue at the top, and then I merged in the lighter Iridescent Electric Blue, and then I'm going around the edges of the cloud with the Bloodstone to get a really dark look, and you could see the granulation coming through. Now, I was working on two paintings simultaneously here, so you'll see stuff happening on the right-hand side, but I've just cobbled the clips together to make it more cohesive, because flipping from one page to the other is really disconcerting. See if you can guess what the other painting is as I work through this one. I absolutely adore this trio of colours. I think they work so beautifully together, and I had a really good time painting these. This is my most abstract painting, I think, and I was only basing my painting from the photo, not totally copying it. I just wanted an idea of the storm clouds, and then I kind of made up the rest of it as I went along. It's a very limited palette, obviously, but it worked really well for the theme of storms, and I drew in some lightning with a white pen. I tried to stick with the paints as much as possible in these without adding anything else, but a couple of them I just felt like it needed a bit of pen, and just drawing the lightning in was much easier than trying to lift paint off to get a lightning. I last minute decided I was going to draw a little house because I was thinking of the Wizard of Oz as well, so there's Dorothy Gale's house going into the storm, and here's my first Stormbreaker painting. I really like how this one turned out. On the second page, I decided to base the painting around Thor, the god of thunder, in particular Thor's hammer Mjolnir. Now, I know in the Marvel movies, I think he actually had a second hammer called Stormbreaker because that popped up, but I hadn't seen that movie, so I just decided I was going to stick with Mjolnir because that's his official hammer and the one which is referenced in Nordic mythology. I think the Stormbreaker one might have just been a made-up thing in the movies. The colour palettes worked really well for this one as well, as I was able to use Bloodstone Genuine for all of his armour and shadow detail, and then I could use the blues for accents and highlights, and with that Iridescent Electric Blue, give that ethereal godlike glow around the hammer. I painted this one in a few layers, so I started off with the background, let it dry, went back to the first painting while that was happening, and then I came back and started adding in more details, including blue highlights there. That hand was looking a bit of a mess, but I did go back and fix it up a bit. That was probably the weakest part of the picture, but I really liked the rest of it. I think it turned out pretty well, and I'm super happy with the hammer. The other thing I did to save a bit of time for this is I printed out all of the photos, and I did just give them a very quick outline trace. If I drew everything from scratch, it would have taken probably twice as long to film this video, and I really just wanted to focus on the paints rather than struggling with drawing, especially with this hammer, which has entirely too many straight edges. I wanted to leave some lightning coming off it as well, and now everything's fully dried. I'm doing another layer on the background. I did lose some of the granulation, but I really wanted it to be darker than it was. The thing with the Bloodstone is it looks dark when you first paint it out, but it really disperses into the paper and goes super granulating, so it does go a lot lighter, and I just wanted to have a nice deep shadow colour. I used quite a lot of iridescent blue in this one, and the Prussian blue as well, which is a really beautiful colour, and I'm so glad I finally have it in my collection. It's a lovely deep blue, but it's not quite as dark as indigo. I also decided to tape all of the pages today, and I'm using 5mm washi tape. I only had a couple of rolls left, and I've gone through them. I had to order some more off Amazon, so you'll see some new ones in the second episode of this with the seasons. And I'm using my white pen again just to touch up the lightning because I did paint over bits and pieces of it and I wanted to make it really white. And I'm also letting the white of the paper show through as well. Of course I couldn't leave the white pen to just the lightning. I had to go around and add some highlights to Mjolnir just to make sure it's standing out properly from the background because everything is looking very blue at this point. And then I just added a few more highlights to the hand and other parts of the armour. And overall I'm really pleased with how this one turned out. I like the colours together and it was a fun one. Sometimes the hardest part is actually coming up with the ideas for a particular theme. But as soon as I saw that Mjolnir picture, I knew that was going to be what I was painting, and here's the finished picture. I really like this one. And here's my Stormbreaker page spread. I absolutely love these three colours. These are still some of my favourites in the Triads. They complement each other so beautifully, and I just love the granulation coming through. That iridescent electric blue is quite shiny in parts. I don't know if you could see it on camera, but I can see it in person. And it definitely added another dimension to this picture, giving it that storm-like quality. Thor's hammer is also showing quite a lot of iridescence as well, along with that crazy granulation from the bloodstone. The iridescence is showing up a bit better in this painting, particularly around the hammer. Overall, I give Stormbreaker 10 out of 10 because I really loved these colours together and I had a lot of fun with these paintings. Let's flip to the next page spread with the theme of architectural. This triad of colours immediately made me think of Greece, because when I was there a few years ago, I went through almost all of my buff titanium. I swear everything is that colour over there. So I went through my photos to see if I could find something suitable, and I found a few contenders, so I've drawn those in, and we will see how these colours go. Buff titanium, lavender and sepia. I thought I would put a title in each corner just to change things up a bit. All of the architectural scenes I've chosen today are actually from Corfu, and they have some really interesting buildings, lots of pretty cafes, and I just really enjoyed walking around the old city with all of its old buildings, tiny little alleyways and cute cafes. It's a really wonderful place to go. Yes, it's very touristy, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and so did Nick. This first cafe picture had exactly the right colours, so I had to pick that one. And I'm using the lavender to mix in subtle shades in with the buff titanium just to kind of break it up, because otherwise it just looks all the same. The sepia also mixed in very nicely with buff titanium, and it worked really well as a shadow colour because I was able to get it quite a lot darker this time. I think because I'd let water sit on it for longer, and so it really activated the paints. I'd reached a point where I needed to let this dry, and so I'm going to move on to the other painting, and I just decided to do something a little more abstract with this, painting in a subtle streak of lavender along with some of that buff titanium and letting it fully dry so I can paint over it again later. Now this other one had dried, so I can add in the shadows, fix up any little mistakes, and enhance those frames with a bit of that shadowy sepia tone. What I like about this set is they have a dark shadow colour in the form of sepia to go along with the much lighter buff titanium and lavender, so I was able to achieve some pretty decent value studies here, getting in those deeper shadows along with the lighter areas, and I really like how that little painting turned out. I kept it quite simple. Now this one's a bit more complicated, and I'm going over all of my underpainting with a darker layer of colour, but of course some of the underpainting is showing through, and I mixed in some of that lavender with the sepia just to once again break it up a little bit and add a bit more interest into the colours. The only thing I couldn't achieve was green for the little pot plants, but I was able to make a greyish mix, and that's just going to have to do for the foliage, along with some lavender flowers and matching lavender pots. It's a very limited palette, once again, being only 3 colours, and it's hard to mix other colours out of these. It's more kind of shades of brown and grey, also that slight purplish tint that you can get with it. But otherwise, these 3 colours complement each other beautifully, and they are really fun for architectural paintings. And I feel like this set is really great for value studies rather than worrying about specific colours, because of course everything's going to have to be in these 3 shades if you're just using these 3 paints, which I was determined to do with this challenge. I really just wanted to paint only with the 3 colours that were available to me for any given triad, and of course this created some real challenges. I had to make up some of the colours, but actually it didn't end up being that bad. It's more about having those values rather than having specific colours, because I think this window looks really great even though these are not the colours that were originally in the photo, or some of them were but not all of them. I'm really glad I added that streak of lavender, and here are these 2 paintings finished. On to this third one, an abandoned building at a tourist beach, and I just really liked it. The colour is completely not for this palette, but I decided I was going to paint it anyway. I mixed the 3 colours to paint a very greyish sky, and once again I painted over the entire thing in patches of lavender and buff titanium. I'm doing a mix of the two colours for all of the building because I figured just painting everything in lavender is going to look pretty boring, or buff titanium for that matter, and I just really love the two colours together. They mix really well, and I think they create some lovely muted pastel-y tones, and everything feels very warm because of that warm buff titanium. Painting with really limited colours like this is a really great way to kind of break out of that comfort zone where paintings have to look exactly like the reference photo and they have to be all the same colour and no deviations are allowed. I get stuck into that trap sometimes, but doing this really pushed me out of those boundaries, and I wasn't actually looking at the colour of the building, I was just coming up with my own colours, and that was just really liberating, making the painting look considerably different from the original photo and the building, which is that pinky colour. So I felt like I learned quite a lot from this particular painting, and it pushed me to see something in a completely different way. Now I'm using the sepia once again for the dark windows, and I think that just really set everything off, having that huge contrast between light and dark. It always makes life easier when one of the trio colours is really dark and has a large value range, so you can lighten it down if you add more water to it, but you can also paint it in deep mass tone like what I'm doing here. 3 of the sets today have that, and 1 set does not. You'll find out a bit later which one that is, and also how much more I struggled with it. But as a trio of colours, this one's really great, and I thoroughly enjoyed painting with them. Let me know in the comments what you might paint with the architectural set. Would you just paint architecture, or have you other ideas? It was a bit hard for me to come up with other ideas as well, so I'm just going literal with the themes here today. Using a tiny bit of white pen for a little bit of highlight, it just needed something, and I drew in the balcony railings at the top with a black pen too. This is the finished painting. It was an interesting exercise, and I actually really like this page spread. I think the colours look wonderful together, and that lavender just really pops out from the other 2 neutral ones. This set is ideal, at least for Greek architecture, and it's really fun to do little studies that don't have to be too complicated, and I think actually focusing on one small area, like that table and chairs or the window, worked out a little bit better than painting the entire building, which was quite a lot harder. My favourite part was adding the lavender to the white. It just made it look so much more interesting rather than stark white shutters. The building's maybe not as strong as the other 2 paintings in my opinion, but I still really enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun, and this one really pushed my imagination. It would be nice if I could have had a blue sky, but it's only 3 colours and I didn't have blue, so there we go. Overall, I'm going to give this lot a 10 out of 10 too, because they're really great colours together. On to the 3rd set, and we've got Evening Glow coming up. I've moved back to Australia for these pictures, and these are photos I took on our trip to the Nullarbor last year. I managed to photograph some really lovely sunsets. I was a bit more dubious about this particular palette though, mainly because I really didn't want to mix green in the sky with that new gamboge and manganese blue hue, which we'll see in a moment. I taped it up and I'm painting new gamboge, manganese blue hue and shadow violet. I'm using a bigger brush once again for this incredible sunset that we saw in the town of Ceduna. To avoid making green, I tried to add the shadow violet in between the yellow and the manganese blue, and it was just a bit of a disaster because the shadow violet and manganese blue hue are both really granulating. They were kind of repelling each other, and you can see it's a hot mess up there. I ended up just going over everything with the shadow violet, and I found that new gamboge and violet together were really beautiful. This just ended up being a total mess, and I really had to trust in the process here, just leaving everything to dry, working on the other page, and then coming back to this one, building up the layers and deepening the shadows. The biggest issue I had is that new gamboge is a really vibrant colour, and it also has no granulation, whereas manganese blue hue and shadow violet are somewhat lower tinting, although I managed to get quite a lot of mass tone out of the shadow violet eventually. But part of the picture is really granulating, and the middle part with the new gamboge is not granulating at all. It looks a bit funny, and I wasn't too convinced by that, but I kept persevering, and I actually did use a pen to draw in the pier, because I knew there was no way I could paint that straight of a line with a brush. You can see how wobbly my horizon is, but the pen just helped a lot for the pier, and I'm really glad I used it, because that just gives it that very precise look with those man man-made lines, contrasting in with that much more abstract background that I ended up painting. New Gamboge is a really stunning colour by Daniel Smith, and it's one of my favourite yellows that I've had. I think it was one of the very first ones I bought as well. It's such a beautifully warm colour. I am using the Shadow Violet to paint in the reflections on the water, and I think that worked out quite nicely. And then I'm adding in a little bit of foreground here, more Shadow Violet, so you can see I was able to get quite a lot of deep colour there once I got going with it. And here I'm just peeling off the tape. I made a bit of a mess up the top, but this is the final picture and I like it much more than when I first started out. On to the second painting, and I really wanted to have that manganese blue hue, so I just decided I was going for broke, and if I get green in the sky, then so be it. You can see what I mean, that manganese is quite lightly tinting, and then when I get the New Gambosian, it's just so much more dominant. But otherwise, manganese blue hue is a very beautiful colour, and it does work very well for sky, except for the fact that it's granulating, and I know some people would not like that, so that is something to bear in mind. If you don't want any granulation, then you're probably better off going with phthalo blue green shade, although that is incredibly tinting, and so you do need to water that down a lot for sky. But I do think phthalo blue would go nicely with this New Gamboge because they're both heavily tinting and very bright colours. I managed to avoid getting too much green in the sky, which I'm happy about. There is a little bit, but it actually ended up not being too much of a problem. Now I've gone completely off from the reference photo here. I just decided I was going to slap paint on, and of course I had far too much, so I'm lifting some of it off around the edges of the painting. I let this completely dry, and then I'm going to go in with the shadow colour, and of course I'm using Shadow Violet for that. This was out on the Nullarbor Plain, so everything is completely flat, except of course I made a bit of a mess with the horizon here. Never mind, I got it as close as I could to being flat. It's okay if it's not perfect because it's supposed to be a painting and not exactly a straight line in nature. I'm using the Shadow Violet in its deepest mass tone to paint in the tree trunk, and then I'll paint in all of the leaves as well. And this sat nicely over my background, working perfectly as a soft silhouette and not as stark as black ink would have been, which is what I normally do for silhouettes, but this worked out much better, and I think it looks more natural and more like my reference photo. But once again, I have that contrast of the blue in the background being very granulating and the yellow being not granulating at all. So it's kind of an odd effect. I'm not sure if I like it. It's very much a personal preference. I tend to prefer everything to either be granulating or not granulating. It's kind of weird when one is granulating and everything else isn't. But that's my own personal preference and a bit of nitpicking. Otherwise, the colours themselves are really lovely, and I think they do work well together, and they do give an evening glow, particularly New Gamboge. I think that is perfect for sunsets and creating that really warm light. I was just trying to fix up my horizon a little bit more there and go over everything to make it a bit darker. It was starting to lift though. As you can see, this is a very lifting paint, so I left it at that, and I'm peeling off the tape even though it's still a bit damp. And here's the finished painting. I like this one too. I think it turned out pretty well. As did the entire page spread. I actually like this so much better than when I first started out. I have a few mistakes here and there, and these were definitely more challenging to paint, but I think the colours are pretty decent for evening glow, particularly the New Gamboge and the Shadow Violet together. As a duo, they're really great. I left that little paint overflow at the top there so you can see that there is a little bit of blue in there as well. It's hiding underneath the Shadow Violet. The granulation is pretty spectacular, I have to say. And flipping over to the other page where we can see that manganese blue hue as well. It's a lovely bright colour, but I feel like a darker blue might have been better. Either phthalo blue for the darker mass tone, or even that Prussian blue which I painted in the Stormbreaker series. That would be quite nice too. But it is such a pretty colour, I can't disparage it too much, and I do like the granulation. Shadow Violet was good for silhouette painting as well. Overall, I'm going to give this an 8.5 out of 10. I like the colours, but they were a bit harder to use than the previous two sets. But let's go for the most difficult ones now, Desert Horizons. It started off out of focus, which didn't bode well for the rest of it. Actually, it's not as bad as what I'm making it out to be, but I definitely struggled the most with this particular triad. This was the longest set of letters, so I had to kind of stack the words on top of each other and change the layout a little bit for this particular page. I'm going to swatch above the letters in a moment. Here we go in focus: Amazonite Genuine, Mont Amiata Natural Sienna, and Burnt Sienna Light. That was very quick, wasn't it? Now, I imagine these three colours are absolutely perfect for American deserts, but of course I'm in Australia at the other end of the world, and they're just not quite the right colours. But I've gone out into the desert for these. 10 years ago, Nick and I went to Uluru, and it is absolutely incredible out there. This was the closest landscape I could get to these three particular colours, and I'm just painting in the rock here. Its English name is Ayers Rock. The two sienna colours actually did work pretty well for it, but I was sorely wishing for Aussie Red Gold. That would have just been the absolute perfect colour for this. The Amazonite Genuine is just a bit too bluey green, but it mixed okay with the natural sienna in there. An even better colour in their collection would have been green gold. So I think if I was to pick this triad for Australian landscapes, I would go for Aussie Red Gold, the green gold, and I feel like I want a blue in this triad. Even the manganese blue hue would be pretty good, so I could have had a nice blue sky. But this picture was just a horrible mess. I couldn't get any detail in it, so I just decided to resort to a white pen to try and add a bit of detail in that foreground. I just lost this completely. I also made a tactical error using this black pen to draw in some of the striations in the rock. It just didn't look right, it was far too stark. So I did fix this up by going over with some of that Burnt Sienna Light to make the lines look a bit redder and more natural. I think what I really struggled with is all three of these colours are not very heavily tinting, and so I was really pushing it to get some darker values in here. I think the Burnt Sienna Light was the darkest of the three colours, so I was able to fix the rock up quite well by the end of it, but it was a real struggle, and I just wasn't convinced by this colour palette. It's just not quite Australian enough. So I'm not too happy with that, but I have a second page to redeem myself, and the other rock formation that is near Uluru is Catajuta, or the Olgas. I have no sky colour, but I just made do with the colours that I had here, and this actually worked out, I think, a bit better than my previous painting. I think of the three colours, the Burnt Sienna Light is the most relevant to this Australian landscape. The earth is very red in the central part of Australia. Monte Amiata Natural Sienna was quite nice as well, to give some more golden variation. And then I'm painting in this puddle reflection, which was quite challenging. I'm using a little bit of Amazonite mixed in with the other two colours to get a slightly greener tone. I'll let that dry, and then I'll paint this last little one, which is a camel. When we were out at Uluru, they happened to have the Uluru Camel Cup, and of course we had to go and see that. They had this race with all of these camels, and it was one of the funniest things I've ever seen, because camels are not horses. They will not be wrangled into little boxes. They just had to corral the riders on the camels up at one end and then just let them go for the race. Most of them actually ran, but one camel decided he was not going to have a bar of it, and he just trotted happily along the race course, not even making it halfway around by the time all the others had run the whole lap. It was so funny. The rider just couldn't do anything about it either. He just had to sit there and smile and wave at the crowd as he trotted by. It was really fun. So I thought I would include a camel in this page spread. I'm starting to add in a bit of detail here. Once again, that Amazonite is a bit too bluey green, but it worked out really well for the reflections in the water, so I'm liking it for that. And I just kind of kept persevering with this one until it looked kind of like the picture. Adding in some rock striations just with the paint this time and not the pen, and that worked out a lot more naturally. The only bit I'm not super happy with is the greenery in the middle, because it's just too emerald green. It needed to be a bit duller. I mixed up a fairly decent brown with all three colours though, and I was able to get in a little bit more shadow, but not as much shadow as I was able to achieve with the other three paintings, so that is where I struggled the most, is just getting those values that I wanted. That's kind of all mid-tone, which is not my favourite thing in the world. Mixing in that same greeny brown colour from all three colours, and I'm just adding it to the background of the camel. I also added it into the sky on the other one as well, because I just didn't want to leave it completely white. So I'd say the three colours do evoke deserts, but maybe more American deserts. Let me know in the comments if you're in America and where would you go if you were going to paint with these colours. Or if you're anywhere else in the world where these colours would be relevant, just peeling off all the tape and going over with a little bit of black pen just to get a bit more of a dark line, particularly in that water, a bit of white pen to enhance those highlights, and I'm just about to finish up with this. Of course I did get a bit pen happy with the camel as well, adding in a bit more detail just to make it look more interesting and outlining the reins, the bridle, I can't think of the word for that part. I think he turned out pretty cute though, and I'm quite happy with the camel. And as I finish up, I do think this page turned out better. I really like the reflection in the water, and overall it's not a bad page spread when I see everything together, but I did struggle with this the most, especially with Uluru. Oh my gosh, that foreground is just a mess. I'm so glad I added the pen because that gave it something, but otherwise it's just not my favourite painting. It happens, I can't win them all, I guess. The colours are really pretty, they do look deserty, it's just not quite the right shade of colour, but that's okay, I did the best with what I had. Maybe some other Australians will say these are perfect colours, they just didn't feel quite right to me, but I think overall they're not too bad. I just wish they were a bit darker, or at least had more tinting strength in them. Overall, I'm going to give a score of 7 out of 10. They're pretty, but not quite enough value contrast. And now it's time to flip through all of the paintings that I've gotten done today, starting off with the inside cover, which is watercolour paper, and I did all of my swatches. I've saved a page to paint in the other 4 triad sets next week, and then I'm going to flip over. We have Stormbreaker. This was definitely my favourite set of the day. I love these 3 colours, I think they're beautiful, and I just had a lot of fun with these paintings. Even though it's a very limited colour palette, it's still quite versatile. Architectural I also really enjoyed, especially to do value studies with buildings, or parts of buildings. Obviously I couldn't get a blue sky, but otherwise these were really fun colours and I thoroughly recommend this set too. Moving over to more challenging ones, and we have the Evening Glow. They are quite spectacular though, particularly that new gamboge, it really stands out, and I enjoyed painting these. They do look sunsetty, but there is quite a lot of granulation, and that may be hit or miss for some people depending on your preference. Plus the propensity to paint green in the sky there. And last up is Desert Horizons, probably my least favourite triad, just because I struggle with them the most. They're pretty colours, but I just want there to be a darker colour in there, so that I could have gotten more variety with the values. They're also maybe not quite right for Australian deserts. Going back to my palette, and I've made quite a dent in some of these, particularly the last one, which is the Burnt Sienna Light. I had to use a lot of it to get the deeper tones. I've also got little dents out of some of the other ones there, like the Prussian Blue, but still plenty of paint left. And the palette is quite messy because I did do some mixing on it, so I'm going to clean that up for next time because I have 4 other triads to paint out, the seasons, and I have no room left to mix, so I'll clean all those other colours up. Come back next week to see me swatch all of these colours and do paintings. But here's the first 4 set of triads, the theme sets. I really enjoyed painting with them. I had a great time, especially with Stormbreaker. That was such a good one. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments. And if you like the video, I'd love a thumbs up. Don't forget to hype it and click the subscribe for more videos, including next week's one. Here's the video I did of all of the swatches, and I'll also put next week's video up once it goes live. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I'll see you really soon in my next video for the other set of triads. Swatch you later. Bye!